Good morning. Can you all hear me in the back? All right. How's everybody doing today? Good. Well, we're going to talk about financing regenerative agriculture today. And how I'd like to start is actually just to have you turn to a neighbor, somebody sitting next to you, ideally someone you don't know, and just connect for a minute and say, what is regenerative agriculture? What do I think it is? And what's important here is not what's quote unquote correct. It's just that you get a sense to notice where you're at now. So just take a minute, say hello, go for it. Okay, take about 30 seconds to wrap up your thoughts. Okay, wrap up your thoughts. Bring your attention back up here. Okay, good morning. My name is Ethan Soloviev. I'm the VP of Research at How Good, which I will tell you more about. And our topic for this morning is financing regenerative agriculture. And I'm really grateful to Gary Nabhan and the rest of the organization that's hosting this for bringing me back to Tucson. And I think you will find some things interesting in here. I'm aiming for big picture, grow your mind and how you see agriculture and how you see financing. I made a cheat sheet for you because sometimes people like to remember what they hear in the keynote. I'm not suggesting that you have to, there will be no tests, but you are completely welcome to remember things. And if you want to, all you have to remember is these three little diagrams on the top. That's sort of like a key to the whole talk. Right? If you just remember those three things, and we'll get into each of them as we go, then you'll be able to remember basically everything that I go through here today. One other note, it is early in the morning, and if anybody's feeling tired or like you need to, take a nap, go right ahead. That would be great. It would be an honor for me to have you resting and getting some sleep in my talk. So do whatever you need to do to make this an enjoyable experience for yourself. All right, so what we're going to talk about today, a little bit of my story and how I got to be here, and then what is regenerative agriculture? What are the characteristics of it? What are the different levels of regeneration that can be achieved? And finally, we'll look at 5 pathways for financing regenerative agriculture and think a little bit about individual projects that you know of, that you have in your life, and which pathway at what level might be the most appropriate for you. So we'll start with me, and I always see myself not as an individual walking around in the world, but as nested within something bigger than myself. So currently I'm here as the Vice President of How Good. I also have a farm, which I'll tell you a bit about. And all of that, my purpose is not just to have a good job or have a farm. My purpose is actually bigger than both of those things. I'm seeking to affect change in the larger agricultural system. I want all agriculture on the planet to be regenerative, as it was perhaps thousands of years ago. A bit about me. I started my journey as a permaculture designer, designing first small home garden landscapes and moving up to start to plant some orchards and getting solar panels on and using permaculture as a whole systems design tool to integrate all the different aspects of sustainability. Taking a permaculture design course was a huge transition moment for me more than a decade ago. As I worked, I realized that it was great to have edible food popping up right outside your doorstep everywhere, but that alone wasn't enough. We needed more to shift the food system. So I started working on farms. I started taking some of my background as a research biochemist and as someone who had traveled around the world studying apples to design more diverse polyculture orchards where I live in the Hudson River Valley. A few hours north of New York City. The Hudson River Valley produces a huge amount of fruit, and however, it's all done in these single monoculture blocks. So you'd see a huge, 100 acres of apples and 20 acres of pears and not much integration between them. So I began to work with clients to transform orchards into more diverse polycultures. This one's got chestnuts and pawpaws and mulberries and hazels along with disease-resistant apples. As we went, I designed larger and larger farms and ecosystems, integrating in water harvesting and management, small food production, berries, mushrooms, and growing my capability to work on a larger scale, understanding how to design for a tractor, how to make things actually efficient for farmers. A lot of the critique that I heard from permaculture and experience was basically, this is great for your backyard, but I'm a farmer. What do I do with this? And so I developed with some colleagues a series of talks that was called Permaculture for Farmers. And we began to learn and listen, how do we scale these concepts up? By the end of the landscape design work I was doing, we were working on 100, 200, 300 acre farms, laying out landscapes based on what was ecologically appropriate, what matched the management desires and styles of the people who were going to be growing there, and what was economically viable for the region. So this is an example in Connecticut. This is a 99-acre protein CSA. So it's a normal CSA model, except they're producing pork, nuts, beans, eggs, and mushrooms. These are these long hedgerows of chestnuts on keyline, which is related to contour, integrating multiple ponds into the system so it can passively harvest and distribute water into the landscape, learning how to work at a bigger scale. After years of doing this, it was wonderful, really great, but I never got to do it for myself. And so my wife and I worked to, and over the last few years, finally figured out how we could purchase our own farm and take everything we learned designing landscapes and put it into use for ourselves. So that leads us to High Falls Farm, which is the 32-acre farm that we now manage. This is just less than a month ago, full bloom in the orchard. It's 18 acres of apple trees, mostly old varieties, not even that old. I wish I could say old. They're mostly modern commercial varieties, McIntosh, Empire, Golden Delicious, Red Delicious. Not the most wonderful fruit and not in any way disease resistant or pest resistant. So we have a lot of work. Plus this orchard hadn't been pruned for about 20 years. So we had a lot of work and still have a lot of work ahead of us in bringing it back into production. Here's my wife and our daughter. In the orchard, you can see our sheep grazing in the background. We have a mix of different breeds focused on wool and meat production. Here's the mixed herd. We got merinos. This is a merino and Corriedale, and some border Cheviots for more grazing. We're doing rotational grazing, moving the fences every day, pulsing fertility back into the understory of the orchard so we can stop using chemical fertilizers from somewhere else. They just eat grass. It's amazing. My wife has started a mushroom operation. So this will be eventually a 1,000-log shiitake and oyster operation. Using the local hardwoods from local contractors who are cutting down trees for forestry work, bringing it to our site, inoculating them with the spawn, and then, God's willing, having huge, luscious fruits of delicious mushrooms. Here we are back in the orchard. We pruned about 300 trees of the 1,200 in the orchard this year. And the other thing we started to do is graft, because of these old varieties not really being fit for a regenerative agriculture production approach. We needed to put in new grafts. So this is top working, adding scion wood into sort of the crooks. Actually, you can see them here along this whole row. So we started with 15 varieties 2 years ago. Now we've grafted in 75 new varieties, a diversity of ancient heirloom apples, a diversity of them from all over the world, from my travels in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, and then also some really new, recently bred disease-resistant apple varieties. Some of them are for cider, some of them are for fresh eating. We're gonna graft maybe 500 varieties into the orchard, see what works, and then change them all again within 10 years. Here's a little map of our farm. I found these great images. There's an interesting thing. You can go to Bing Maps. I don't know how good it is for Arizona. I don't really like Bing Maps. I'm a Google guy most of the time. But you can get these bird's eye views of your property that are really amazing, helpful for landscape design. So here you can see the 18 acres of orchards. And I wanted to show you this to get a sense of scale, but also start to get a sense of context, because regenerative agriculture is not about best practices. It's not about the cool varieties I put in. It's not about just running the sheep under the apple trees. Those are great, but to really have a deeply regenerative agriculture, I believe we need a deeper understanding, context, and story of the place we're in. So zooming out a little bit to give you a bit of context, this is the town of High Falls, after which our farm is named. Here's the creek, the Rondout Creek, which flows up and into the Hudson River and then down to New York City. The falls, these are the actual High Falls. There they are. They're a 6-minute walk from our farm. And they're quite amazing and have been there for a lot longer than the town of High Falls has been there, and have been there for a lot longer than European colonists were there. And so there's something about learning the longer term story. I try to always do a 500 million year story of whatever place I'm working in, because understanding that long-term story allows you to remember yourself as part of the ecosystem that you're in. The other reason I wanted to show you this is because here's the How Good office. How Good's a small startup company based in Brooklyn and High Falls, New York. Our research office is in a purple barn. And this is where we look at food and other products and begin to get a sense of what's happening, what's the best products that are out there in the world, and what are the ones that are not producing beneficial effects for humanity and the world. So How Good is also in this larger context of place. So I will tell you a bit about How Good. We are focused on improving the way people shop and on changing decision-making and changing how people make decisions at that moment where you're in the co-op, where you're in the grocery store, trying to decide between 6 different peanut butters. You don't know which one to get. This one says non-GMO. This one says organic. What do I choose? How Good rates the entire food system on a continuum of regeneration. And we point out what are the really good products that are better than 75% of everything that's out there in the food system. What are the great products that are better than 85%? And what are the best, the top 5% of the current food system, according to a whole host of ecological and social indicators. There's 70 that we look at. They include things like organic certification and fair trade and corporate social responsibility and the processing practices that go into making a food product. How Good partners with grocery stores. So we are in, by the end of this year, we'll be in 250 stores in 26 states. And we rate everything in the whole store. So as you're walking around, you see these little tags, those little good, great, best tags next to the most exciting products, the best produced, the most sustainable products in the store. We've rated over 200,000, which makes it so that we have the largest sustainability food database in the world. And in 2016, we influenced about 136 million purchases of foods. The exciting thing is when you put a best rated sticker next to a product on a store shelf, the sales of that product jump anywhere from 30% to 230%. The overall grocery store increases its revenue by somewhere between 3 to 7%. So everybody's winning. Customers, shoppers, you are getting better food. The brands that are having the most amazing sustainable practices show increased revenue, and the grocery stores do well. We have an app, a free app. You can go download it to scan a barcode or search for any product in the US food system, soon to be going more global. You can see the best rated products in different categories. You can zoom in and take a look at, there's a polyface flank steak. You can look at the 3 benchmark areas that we study: growing guidelines, processing practices, and company conduct. You can zoom into those and see the different factors that are part of growing guidelines, how the farming's done, how the livestock's handled, what is the sourcing and procurement like, and then zoom in even further and see the actual principles and practices that we're looking for when we rate a product. So this is all about increasing food transparency. And this doesn't just work for small grocers and people who are already interested in this. The 230% jumps are in mainstream grocery stores that are more and more beginning to pick up our service. So there's actually videos on Fox News talking about this, which is very surprising to me. If you want to see it here, you can go to the Food Conspiracy Co-op in Tucson. They have been partners with us for a number of years now, and you can see our How Good ratings on their shelf tags. So I went over there yesterday, met with the general manager. It's an awesome store, really high quality stuff, and you can see How Good in action while you're there. So let's go back to some of these numbers. In fact, I want to zoom in on this, this number of 200,000 food products rated. What does this let us do? What does this allow us to see in the world? Yeah, we see the whole global system of supply. We see where all the food is coming from all over the world to make it to North America, to make it to the United States food system. And we get to see the whole range. All right? We see the best. We see the worst. And from that, we've been able to develop and design a spectrum, a continuum. This is a map of all the practices in the whole food system. This is the first little thing on the cheat sheet that I showed you at the beginning. Right? This spectrum from degenerative, the most destructive, extractive, community and landscape destroying practices, all the way up to the most regenerative, the things that increase vitality, vibrancy, health of whole ecosystems, of communities, of producers, of human beings. Where would sustainability be on this little map? I'm seeing people going like this. Sustainability is somewhere right in the middle here. Right? What does sustainability mean? It means you can sustain. It means stay where you are and keep it that way. So I'm a huge fan of sustainability, and I think it's not enough. I think we need to go past sustainability into restoring, healing, and creating new potential in the landscape. And it actually turns out, as I've been doing research on this and on regenerative agriculture in particular, one of the earlier folks that figured that out was Rodale. Back in the 80s, before there was actually a Regenerative Agriculture Association that published a few books, and then he had an untimely and sad death. And it sort of went down under the surface like a whale, came up and went down. And now it's starting to show its head again. So for How Good, here's a map that you absolutely can't read, but you'll be able to find this on the website, that takes the spectrum from degenerative all the way up to regenerative and looks at each of our 3 benchmark areas and the 12 different spectra that we rate: farming practices, livestock handling, the different ingredients that are used, how it's processing done. And it lays out, well, if you were on the degenerative end of the spectrum for ingredients, it'd be, petroleum-based, heavy in preservatives and unnatural things. Corn syrup actually comes from a plant. So that's even a step, maybe a little bit up. Right? All the way to, on the far end, is the most beautiful tomato that you just pulled out of your garden, having been nurtured by years of compost and love, and it's fresh and delicious. There's nothing added to it. there it is. Okay, so this map is designed to invite farmers and consumers and everyone understand the breadth of what's possible. Not necessarily to judge or critique, but more to say, well, where are we now and where can we go? What is the potential of regeneration that we could get to by taking that next step or by jumping 10 steps ahead? So we get to see the whole food system in the United States. And I wish I could say that most of the food was down here, but it's not. Unfortunately, it's not. This is actually my least favorite slide in the whole presentation because I don't like showing this. I don't like that we have to see this. 85% of the products we rate in the United States are still on this end of the spectrum. There's 10% that are moving towards sustainability, ecologically, economically, human, socially. And then the top 5%, the best, they're sort of little just blips, you know, scattered out. There are some that are working in this really regenerative agriculture space. They exist, but they're few and far between. Part of how goods work is to invite everybody. We work with all brands. We've been getting calls from folks like Unilever and Kellogg's saying, we can see the trend is moving in this direction. What do you think about our products? How can we improve? So we want to move the food system this way on the spectrum. Not with judgment or criticism, but just by saying, hey, this is where things are going. This is what people want to eat. Let's head in this direction with all of our practices, with all the ways that we think about food, and see what the most beautiful regenerative place we can get to is. So, in agriculture, I'm not going to spend time focusing on this side. There's plenty of places you can go and videos you can watch, and we don't need to talk about this. This is well known at this point, what the destructive, extractive practices are. I want to send us out this way because I don't actually believe that problem solving is the most effective way to get to the future that we want to live in. I actually think that it's more useful to stay in this realm of potential, of where could we go? What could we achieve? What would it look like if it were the most beautiful agricultural food system that we could ever imagine? So once you get into regenerative agriculture, there's actually on this end, we've identified 4 levels of regenerative agriculture that I'm going to talk a bit more about. These are not the only 4. Hopefully there's a little 5, 6, 7, 8, but we don't have enough people growing and working and processing down here that we can articulate it much more than this. In fact, I'm barely even going to touch to level 4. Right? We have some ideas, but it's up to the community of practice. It's up to the organic farmers and the indigenous farmers and the large-scale commercial farmers to figure out what it looks like here and beyond. So this is a proposal and an invitation. I forgot to mention this. Don't believe anything that I say today. Don't believe it. Just do not take my word for it. But at the same time, don't reject anything I say. Just try it on. Test it out for yourself in your own experience, on your own farm, in your own store, in your own work. Try it on and see what makes sense for you and evolve it from there. So here are the 4 levels of regenerative agriculture, starting with functional, moving up to integrative, jumping to systemic, and eventually evolutionary. Here's an image of functional regenerative agriculture. Functional regenerative agriculture captures carbon in the soil. The goal of it is to regenerate soil, put carbon back in there, get it out of the atmosphere, increase soil productivity, increase water holding capacity, help plants and thereby humans and animals grow. So anybody know what this image is without looking at the thing on the bottom right? So this is the long-term research trials at the Rodale Institute. For 30 years, they've been doing organic side by side with conventional and monitoring the results. and they put out a paper a couple of years back on what they call regenerative organic agriculture, which does indeed, they've shown, capture carbon in every acre of soil and lead to decreased inputs over time. A lot of the thinking that goes into carbon farming and this sort of level 1 regenerative agriculture is very much about fighting against climate change. Climate change is seen as an evil enemy to be vanquished. And that's important. That's a good step. And the way that things work in the functional level is through best practices. So there's a best practice of low tillage. There's a best practice of using fertilizer, compost as organic fertilizer. And you take these best practices and you apply them in different places. That's important. That's a good step. This is level 1 regenerative agriculture. In level 2, we take a more integrative approach. We take a design systems approach. It's not just best practices, it's looking at whole ecosystems. And the goal isn't just to regenerate soil, it's to regenerate the whole. It's to regenerate water, biodiversity, human communities. And we're aiming to turn Earth at this level into a paradise. This is an example from Barbados, where one of my consulting companies has a long-term client that is actually a sand mine. It's a large silicon sand mine that for 50 years has been part of the extractive economy of the place. And the owners of the sand mine decided, we've taken a lot, let's start giving. What can we do to repair and heal this landscape? So yeah, so this was a sand mine, and now it's a multi-story tropical food forest full of all different species, working only with compost and the local farmers to replant it and restore it and have it as a biodiversity habitat and food-producing landscape for the whole island. You can look it up at Walker's Reserve. I think it's just walkersreserve.com. You can see the whole design. You can learn a lot about the process. So this is integrative regenerative agriculture. But there's still farther to go. In level 3, we're starting to get systemic. We're looking not at an individual farm and how to regenerate the soil and the ecosystem. We're saying, well, what if a farm is part of a larger ecosystem of businesses, of enterprises? How can we interact between all of them to produce regeneration? How can we trade in multiple forms of capital? Social, financial, living, spiritual, cultural. How can we exchange those in order to grow and regenerate the whole system? And finally, level 4 is evolutionary regenerative agriculture. Here, we're looking at the deep story of a place. We're learning from the indigenous lifeways, and in many places, like in Arizona, you're so blessed to have so many indigenous lifeways and tribes and people still here who remember, who have a 1,000-year oral tradition of regenerative agriculture in a place. There's so much to learn. And you have to go that far back in time to harmonize and align with the essence and the spirit of a place. Agriculture here is not so much, I was talking with Michael Johnson last night, and agriculture is not so much agriculture as it is culture. Agriculture is a ritual that is part of life, that is life. It's not separate from it. It's not even part. That's the wrong, I said it wrong. It is life. And I should say at this point, we're talking agriculture and horticulture, and in many cases, in many parts of the world, even where my indigenous ancestors came from thousands of years ago, it was a nomadic and a semi-nomadic horticultural engagement more than an agriculture. I have an example here from a tribe in Kenya. This is the Maasai It's a Maasai women's group. It's connected to the Laikipia Permaculture Center and the Permaculture Research Institute of Kenya. And they have been nomadic herders, landscape farmers for uncounted generations, and are now cultivating some horticultural crops. They're actually growing an aloe that's in connection with a global cosmetics company that I've worked with. But agriculture isn't this separate thing that they need to learn best practices about. Agriculture is fully, ritually part of life and existence. And then I also started thinking, I always like to see how I can ground it and make it real for me. So I started looking back into my ancestry. Irish on one side, Eastern European Jewish on the other, and saying, well, what were our agricultural traditions when we were intact and figuring out how to regenerate landscapes as we went? And so there's this really amazing one. Anyone know what this is? If any of you have European ancestry, then this was there in your ancestry. Any guesses? Druids, getting close. I haven't heard the word yet. You actually sing about it at Christmas time. There we go. Of course he knows. This is a wassail or a wassail. You've heard the song, Here We Go, a wassailing, right? So this is a very ancient pre-Christian pagan agricultural tradition where, in this case, the apple trees, me being an apple farmer is very excited about this. The apple trees are blessed at the darkest time of year with lights and hard cider, and you give them bread, and you gather around the apple trees and make this bonfire and shout and sing and bless the apple tree to have huge yields and crops in the next year. And you bang pots and pans, and if you're in Arizona or New York, you shoot off your guns and scare away all of the evil spirits that would be attacking your trees. And it turns out, upon further research, that it wasn't just apple trees. There's many different crops, and people would wassail from place to place. They would go in these processions, bringing the songs and the good, supportive energy, and maybe tracking some of the mud on their feet and bringing the good biology from one farm to the next to restore and regenerate the life in the farm. So I think as we all head back, as we head towards regenerative agriculture, we will find ourselves looking back and making new again, integrating it into how we are now and where we want to head in order to regenerate our soils, our ecosystems, our communities, and the larger agricultural system. Is that cool? Does that make sense? If you want to dig in and get geeky about this, I wrote a little paper that lays out these levels in detail and has a set of principles and kind of guidelines for each of the levels. So if you want a copy, just send me an email, Ethan@howgood, and I'll get it over to you. Most people don't read it. So if you actually want to read it, then email me. If you're just going to get it and file it away on your computer somewhere, don't bother. But I'd love people to read it and tell me what I got wrong, and tell me where we could add, and tell me what level 5 is, because we don't know. Okay, so now let's talk about financing. These are the 5 paths that I was able to identify. They're not perfect, they're not always right. There's probably a couple things missing, but this gets probably 95% of how it works. Here's the 5 paths for financing agriculture. Starting with number 1 down here, invest and scale. This can include loans, but taking on investment of some form, usually. So I'm talking mostly about financial capital here. There are many other forms of capital that map more or less to this, but we're really focusing on money, fiat currency in this case, although maybe there's some farmers out there who are working in digital cryptocurrencies to fund their farms. I would love it if there were, and I'd like to talk to you if you're interested in that. But we're talking about fiat financial capital here. So invest and scale is one, crowdfund is another. Supply engage is one that I have some significant experience in, which is working with suppliers that are further along in the stream of value production in order to grow and regenerate production at the base. So that's supply engage. Fund earn. This is definitely what I'm going to do, which is just figure out how to make the money and grow your farm by yourself. Or not necessarily by yourself, but through having an awesome marketing plan, through having a great brand like was shown here yesterday. They're doing all the good things to just grow organically, in a way, your business. And then finally, need fill, which we will talk a little more about, but it's basically tuning into the needs of your place, of your community, and figuring out how to kickstart things using the gaps where you are. I want you to choose just take a minute right now, and I want you to choose a particular project that you are related to in some close way. Your farm, or a farm of a friend, or a project you're working on, but get something actually specific and concrete in your head, because I'm going to ask you to kind of think about that as we move through each of these. So just take a minute, actually write it down on your computer or your paper. That'll actually make it really concrete. Anybody not have one? Choose one. Can't have several, it's not going to work. Anybody else not have one? All right, you're fast. Great. So keep that in mind as we go through. So these are the 5 basic paths. And the question that I want to ask here is, what would it look like to take on each of these 5 paths at each of the 4 levels of regenerative agriculture? So basically, we're gonna do this. We're gonna go back and forth through this. And we're gonna start with level 1 and say, what would it look like to invest and scale at level 1? And see how far we get. All right, so looking at invest and scale at functional regenerative agriculture. So again, this is basic carbon farming, improve the soil through good best practices. All right, so here's an example of Maple Hill Creamery. This is in the Northeast. They're 100% grass-fed, and they're producing value-grown, value-added products. So started with yogurt, and now they're extending into different products. You can get a maple syrup sweetened kefir that they make. It's really good. You can now, I just saw in the co-op right before I left, they just started with milk. That's grass-fed milk. It's ultra-pasteurized grass-fed milk, but it's grass-fed milk. And they have gone the invest and scale route. They have taken on significant investment capital from family offices and investors out in the world. That means that they don't fully own their business anymore. This is one of the interesting aspects of the invest and scale approach. The other thing is, as it says, is it's scale. Even the most wonderful slow money investors that I've ever met still want to see some growth over time. Even if it's only to get that low 5% capital return, they still want to see that. And so there is built into an invest and scale approach in the vast majority of cases, the expectation that you're going to figure out how to have a financial capital profitable business model and grow your business so you can pay back the investment that went in. If you want to scale rapidly and you've got a working business model, this can be awesome. This can be really effective. And if you're doing it in a way that's growing grass-fed beef and milk and putting carbon back into the soil, then this is a very exciting proposition because you can grow it over larger acreage quickly. All right, let's look at crowdfunding. So there's a whole bunch of sites out there now for crowdfunding your farm. This one's called Barn Raiser, it's probably the best known. There's just another one that was launched in Australia. And the idea here is whatever you're doing, you're not necessarily going to accredited investors who will own some of your farm, but you're asking to the larger network, your social network, and the larger social network to put in bits of money from a whole bunch of different places to grow. I'm not an expert in crowdfunding, and actually there's a talk just after I'm done here where there's some people who are really going to look at more of the details of the kind of nuts and bolts of how to do these. I'm purposefully not addressing that here. So from a functional regenerative agriculture perspective, what you would be crowdfunding is not just you're a normal, just run-of-the-mill conventional farm. You would be aiming to crowdfund a farm that had as its explicit goals to be capturing carbon in the soil and fighting against climate change. And so crowdfunding in that situation would be pulling on that heartstring, if you will, of the world right now as the attention and awareness grows, and gathering that momentum and energy to rush you forward. Okay, supply engage. I love this realm of stuff, and I actually get to use a example from here, from Hyder, Arizona, from my friends Freddie and Freddie Sr. and the Gutierrez family in Hyder, Arizona, who for 30 years have been producing this crop. Anyone know what it is? Jojoba, right? So this indigenous to the Sonoran bioregion crop had a huge boom about 30 years ago. Thousands and thousands of acres were planted, most of which died because they didn't have good best practices of functional regenerative agriculture figured out and set up. A few people and a few families persisted. There's Freddie and Freddie Sr. and his brother doing some design work in the jojoba fields. And they have figured out over 30 years how to produce this crop organically, certified organic, 100% of their operation. Now, where this gets interesting is jojoba is an extremely high value, high margin crop in the personal care and cosmetics industry. And so there are basically every global cosmetics company in the world right now has got jojoba in their formulations. Even if it's only 0.2%, they still want to put it on the bottle and say made with jojoba oil. And so there's this looking around of where can we get jojoba, but then there's also this realization that if it's not grown regeneratively, jojoba takes a huge amount of water to have a consistent annual yield of the little nuts. And so one of the global cosmetics companies that I worked with, they had developed an investment fund that was within their company to invest into the sources of supply around the world to step them towards regenerative agriculture. And so I helped them to go around and in the different ingredients they were interested in, jojoba being one, cacao being another, honey being another, and understand the growing ecosystem, not just how it grows, but the human ecosystem that grows and produces the crop, and to figure out where are there acupuncture points in this system where we can put a little bit of investment, a little bit of time, a little bit of creativity, and transform what's happening. And so this company partnered with Jalisco Jojoba and worked out a whole landscape design for regenerative jojoba production. They took a small test plot, and rather than irrigating, they did all the earthworks and water harvesting so that they could experiment with a low input regenerative jojoba production, capturing carbon in the soil, but then also diversifying the crops. So it wasn't just jojoba. There's other crops, probably 15 different species that went in as trials for food production and other cosmetic uses right in the same landscape. And so this is exploratory, this is research-based, but the burden was not held by the farmer in this case. The burden was held by the company of whom they supply, to try out moving in a regenerative direction. I think there is a huge amount of potential in this route of supply engage. And it takes some creative thinking and understanding who are the larger producer companies that might need some of what you're growing. And sometimes it's surprising stuff. Like sometimes, I don't know, I was just weeding my garden the other day and pulling out these really vigorous silvery mugwort. It's an Artemisia species. And I was pulling it out and being like, man, this stuff is a real weed. I pulled it out last year. It's in the same spot. I can't get it out of here. And then I realized, because for how good I've been doing this research We're going to start rating cosmetic products soon. So we're going to roll out a whole new rating system for personal care. So you can see the good, great, and best, and standards not met for all of personal care. And so I've been looking through this ingredient list of about 30,000 different chemical ingredients that can go into any personal care product. And I realized that one of those ingredients, as I'm sitting here grumpy weeding, is, essential oil of mugwort. I was like, oh, maybe I should just transplant this and, get it into another field and get it growing and figure out how to distill it. And maybe I could get some funding from that company I worked for to do that research and have a local organic grown source of this weed that I can't get rid of. Right? So I think there's a lot of creative opportunities, and there's other ones outside of personal care and cosmetics. But I'll tell you what, has anybody here bought a personal care or cosmetic product recently? Okay. Are they cheap? Oh no, they're not. They're way more expensive than food. And the margins are a lot better too. So I believe that many personal care companies have there's more margin to work with, but that margin, more and more, larger companies, even L'Oreal has a plan to be carbon neutral by 2020. That's amazing. I hope they achieve it. I don't think they will. But they have some financial capital floating around that could be invested in creative cosmetic-based solutions, but that also support farms that are doing really great food growing to thrive. So lots of opportunity here. Okay, 4, Fund-Earn. This is a local example from where I live. It's Four Winds Farm in the Hudson Valley. 20 years, it's a completely no-till system. So they just don't till anymore. They add compost to their no-till beds every year. It's mostly focused on annual veg production, but they also have fruit trees. They have cows, but the cows are just for milk and manure. And the manure actually gets carried into this greenhouse. This is a straw bale barn, solar-powered straw bale barn. And they've got these little, it's very brilliant, simple design. They've got these concrete block beds that they load up with manure through the growing season. And then they just, put plywood over the top and put their seedlings on top. And the composting of the manure over the winter heats their seedlings. All right, so this is just very good, carbon farming, excellent thinking. And they never went out and tried to make a pitch deck and go find some investor to give them capital. They earned it. They worked hard and figured out really cool niche markets. They do a seedling sale. They're spending all this time making seedlings, and then they figured out that they could make a lot more money selling the seedlings than they could the finished vegetables. So they have an annual seedling sale. That's a huge, financial benefit to them. So they were creative, but have figured out how to grow an excellent, highly carbon sequestering farm through their own ingenuity and fund earning. And then we'll look at one example here of need fill. So this is the Philadelphia Orchard Project. Has anybody ever heard of this? This is amazing. I went to school outside of Philadelphia. Philadelphia has 40,000 vacant lots. Right? And a number of folks said, well, what if we planted these up with orchards, with permaculture style, mixed fruit, polycultures of food for areas that are food deserts, that have nutritional challenges. And so they've now gone and planted out more than 50 community orchards throughout the city of Philadelphia. Yeah, here's a map. So they're all over the city of Philadelphia with these orchards in the ground. And it's become an educational hub and a community hub because there weren't green spaces, especially not green spaces as food, available to many citizens of the city. And so it's a nonprofit organization. They get some grant funding, and they get most of their energy and attention and volunteer from the community because there's a need for this here. So they identified a need and worked with it and grew with it. So this is need fill. Okay. All that was level 1, regenerative agriculture. So now you get to stretch your mind a little bit and think, all right, that was good functional stuff. What happens when we go to integrative? How is the funding thinking and the financing structure going to change? And I think I'm just going to do a few examples from here and leave some time for questions and thoughts from you all. One thing I'll say, oh, and the other thing, that's right, is keep your project in mind. Have you figured out which of the 5 pathways is probably the most interesting or exciting for you? So keep your project in mind as we work on this level, because one of the things that starts happening at Integrative is you don't do just one. You figure out connections between them. Often, for whatever reason, it doesn't happen with the ones next to each other. It happens across the star. I don't know exactly why, but that's how it seems to turn out. Where you're integrating usually 2, sometimes 3 of these financing pathways to make the whole system work. And that reflects the integrative nature of what happens when you're working regenerative agriculture that way. Okay, so here's using Invest in Scale at level 2. This is Grasslands LLC. They are the land management arm of the Savory Institute, which pioneered holistic management, rotational planned grazing. And Grasslands LLC, they have 5 ranches, totaling 204,000 acres. All over the world, from New Zealand to Florida to Montana. And they are working not just to add carbon to the soil, though that definitely happens, but they are regenerating whole ecosystems, water, community, biodiversity, and measuring it and monitoring it really, really well. So they have taken, again, investment capital from accredited investors, family offices, et cetera, in order to be able to get in less than 10 years operating time, in order to manage 204,000 acres globally. Right? And they actually, in some cases, purchase the land itself. So they're not just managing, they'll purchase the land, and then it's kind of interesting idea. It's real estate, right? Buy low, sell high, but you're buying low in ecological integrity and viability, restoring that over time, and then there's the opportunity to sell some of the land while keeping the 99.99% of it in productive grass-fed beef producing use. All right, so here's and the sort of link there from Invest in Scale is they're also filling a real need that was found as Savory went around the world, is that there was financial capital, accredited investors with significant financial capital to invest, who were looking for places to put it that would regenerate the earth, and there weren't very many opportunities available. And so it was actually filling a very different need for a very different community, but one that was valid and has helped them to grow. Here's an example of crowdfunding. This is Ridgedale Permaculture. This is the farthest north permaculture farm on the planet. It's almost at 60 degrees north latitude in Sweden. So it's way, way, way up there. And they have developed a keyline agroforestry system. And the way they've crowdfunded is not for their farm. What they actually crowdfunded for was their book, Making Small Farms Work, which is a great read, and they're now working, actually it looks like it was just funded, to do a film that's a documentary. So they were using a crowdfunding strategy in order not just to help their farm, but looking in an integrative way. What they saw was missing was more other farms using a carbon farming model. So they use the crowdfunding in order to share and expand the understanding in the world of what they had figured out how to do on their farm. I think we're gonna stop there.
Can you put the picture of the star on it?
Maybe. I'm gonna have to jump a bunch forward here. There we go. Okay, so what I'm going to invite you to do is, I just talked a lot, you heard a lot, so I'm going to invite you to turn to a neighbor again and just briefly kind of highlight, well, here's the key question that I have about this, or here's an aha moment that I had as we were going through this. We'll just share for a minute, and then I'll take questions and do some response for the last 10 minutes here. So turn to a neighbor, go for it. Right.
Good.
Hold on.
Oh, you're still on? We'll talk.
So about 30 seconds to wrap up your thoughts, get your questions clear. All right, you can start to wrap up your thoughts. Okay, wrap your thoughts, bring your attention back up here. I'll just say, if you want to get in touch with me, you can find me on Twitter at Ethan Soloviev. If you want to check out How Good, there's the Twitter handle for How Good. And what questions did you have? What emerged for you, or aha moments, or questions you have for me about the regenerative spectrum, the 4 levels, or the 5 financing pathways? This man, yes.
Scale, obviously, the majority of the world are best management practices. So as you scale and you rate these products, and then you fell into the spectrum, whether you're a conventional or you're sustainable, we were talking, I was talking to Josh about the fact that, I'm no young pup. I mean, I'm a little bit older, but I think I'm kind of a tweener, and that I get conventional, but I also get sustainable. So I'm trying to figure out, like, there's good things you can do that we've learned through conventional. I mean, you're on a conventional apple farm that you're changing up, and I'm trying to do things a little different too, and trying to figure out different ways. And so those rankings sometimes to me can scare the crap out of me, because I can be told I'm doing an incredible job from these people, and then I can be told I'm doing crappy job over here.
Totally.
And so I don't know. I just kind of just thinking about, how is, I guess my question to you would be really is how do you define? I mean, that's my question.
It's a really great question, and it's basically I think that there's a real downside to rankings, and there's a real downside to certifications, and the big part of that downside is that it seems to take away your internal locus of control. It's somebody else coming in from outside and saying, well, this is that, and this is not good, and this is good. And I think there's a real issue with that. I think that the most incredible regenerative development comes from you on your farm, knowing what exactly it's going to be, pulling from all different experiences that you've had, that's going to make the land, the ecosystem, the community, your economy, make it all work. And so I would offer what How Good does, not as somebody trying to tell you what you are, but as somebody that's showing the range of possibilities, so that you can look into it and say, well, yeah, they got that right, I am doing that, and wait, they got this totally wrong. And that enables a bigger conversation. Without the whole map, it's harder to have it. People tend to think of it in black and white. We really like to have the whole continuum. And we like to have discussions. There are often times that brands or farmers call us up and say, wait a minute, I don't think you got that right. And we'll say, great, tell us, explain it, tell me more about your practices. And oftentimes we'll change the ratings because we're very interested in that back and forth. And we don't know everything. We're learning from the community of practice that's doing it. So I think there's a real value in what we're doing because it enables a systematic change in the whole food system. And I think there are some real issues with it that are exactly what you're talking about. So yeah, thank you.
Hi, actually, I don't have a question. I have more of a comment. I really, really love what you're doing because it's in line with kind of my view. And my personal quote that I often use is the wisdom of the ancients is patiently waiting for the modern world to catch up. It's like a time continuum, like, wait a minute, maybe we should go back to how things were done eons ago because it worked. All food was organic until we tried to improve it.
Thank you for that comment. I would respond that it's not as simple as going back. It's useful to look and learn from the ancestry of the land. You were saying the wisdom of the ancients of the land, of your own heritage, whatever that is. But you can't restore something that was. You can't just take something from the past and bring it to the now. It won't be the same. It won't work the same. We actually have to design and create, I believe, something new, something that learns from that, but is actually fresh and relevant to our current context, our current economy, and current situation. So yes, and more. This man over here, and then there's some folks over here.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. It's real helpful. And the thing that hits me about the whole situation is that the concentration of control and wealth in the hands of a few, like the first keynote, he brought up just the wealth disparity, that what is it, like 9 people control half the wealth of the world or something. And that's worse than it was 15 years ago, when it was 100 people. Now it's 9. I think that's what we're up against. I mean, really, that's what we're up against, because it becomes, to me, like what it seems like what you're doing, even the name of the company, how good. It is good and evil. It is a moral question. It's like right and wrong. And I think we're in this room because we want to do right for the planet. And regardless if some people are conventional farmers, some people are organic. I understand why people are conventional farmers, like being an organic farmer. I understand that there's a certain moment that you would maybe want to use something more drastic to maintain the control over your livelihood. Like, I understand that. I don't agree necessarily with all the chemicals, but I'm not going to judge a farmer for spraying glyphosate once or twice in a field that's completely overrun with weeds, when the lethal dose of Tylenol is worse than glyphosate. I mean, how many chemicals do we eat every day? So we can't be fundamental, but yeah, I'd like to hear, how do you, in where I sit, it's like there has to be a point where you say no, like to a certain level of ridiculous greed and control, which results in the destruction of our planet. I mean, how do we say no together? And you can say yes too to what's right, but there is a time when you have to stand up together, and that's the only time that anything's ever changed, it seems, is when everyone agreed that the way that this is working is not the way this, and there's a new way to do things. Okay. And so how would you speak to the concentration of power in the hands of a few, and what can we do to stand up against that and create a solution?
That's a big question. I understand how you feel, and there's a time in my life when I felt similar to that. But at this point, I have to respectfully disagree that it's a good and evil thing, that it's a right and wrong. And I can make an intellectual argument about that, but I'll switch it and do a more personal one, which is I was paying attention to myself and how I felt as I was giving this talk, and then as I was hearing what you were saying. And I noticed that the thing for me, and this might be different for everyone here, that motivated me to go out and make the large systems changes that you very clearly, see are necessary, are possible. What fired me up to do that was the potential and the possibility of what we could get to, and not the problem that we're currently facing. And so I approach it from a different perspective. And we are aiming to highlight the most amazing, the best in the world, and let that grow, as opposed to focusing on what's wrong and what doesn't work. I support people who do that. I think it's necessary. It's not the path that I choose, and it's not the path that How Good did. Let me just, one little story about that. When How Good started, we put all the ratings on the store shelves, right? So we put the best and the great and the good, but then we also put the so-so, and not that good, and really bad, and, terrible, right? And it didn't work. People went into the stores. First of all, grocers hated seeing 70% of their stuff as this is bad, right? And then people went in and they said, who are you to say I really like that product? And they would buy it anyway, even though I had a terrible rating. And so we changed to focus on lifting up and elevating the greatest potential that things could be. I'm not saying the other approach is wrong, but I'm just saying this is the way we are moving towards it in the world. And overall, a regenerative perspective focuses on potential and not on problems. So I think we had 1 or 2 questions over here, and then I'll wrap up.
So I'm so glad you're here, because we have gotten into the regenerative farming, and it's amazing. What I would say to the previous comment, there are all kinds of wealth. The fiat wealth can disappear overnight. The wealth we're building is forever. There's also one other comment. Do you know Chris Martinson?
Yeah.
And he's working with how to really scale this up, so that you integrate the ranchers, the farmers, the forest people, everybody into one thing. And I think that's the way to go for everybody. That way it involves everyone.
Awesome. Let's end it with that. I think the octogenarian farmer in the room just nailed it. So thank you very much. And I look forward to talking with you all in the break and beyond. Cheers.